Hi everyone. I am doing a video lecture on grammar, and I'm doing that because there's not a lot of time or space within the class itself where we can really talk about some of these important parts about writing. And since writing is a really important part of the class, there's some particularly valuable types of grammar that you want to have some knowledge of. I'm not doing this with the expectation that I'm gonna talk about, these things and you're gonna immediately be able to do them perfectly. But what I've got listed here are the things that I plan on talking about in this video lecture. And these are the things that have to do with how we put sentences together. And I'm choosing to do this because across the years, and I'm seeing it in the classes I'm teaching now as well, is that how we grammatically join sentences and how we join ideas is one of the most difficult things to do in writing. So having some awareness of how grammar can impact that, and when grammar is used ineffectively, it can impact your meaning, and that's where knowing grammar, having a stronger awareness of it, becomes really critical to the writing that you're doing, and particularly argumentation. So I also have a student sample here. This is an old paper, and I just pulled it because it just has text available to me, but it was graded as an F, so it also has a lot of space where I can go in and offer some corrections, especially when I'm talking about cohesion. And the one thing I don't have on this list that I'm going to add that has to do with it is the coordinating and subordinating conjunctions. And some of the stuff I'm hoping will sound familiar to people, but if you're brand new to it, or if you haven't heard of it, and since we first learn these things when we're in like third or fourth grade, it's okay. It's just things that you kind of want to be aware of when you're writing. So the first thing I'm going to talk about are independent and dependent clauses. So because knowing what those are is the foundation for knowing the rest. So independent clause is a clause, and we'd like to use the word clause more than sentence, because sentence means something slightly different than clause. But I'm just going to use clause, but a sentence is a clause, and a clause is a sentence. But we tend to talk in terms of clauses rather than sentences. So an independent clause is a clause that is independent, meaning that it has a subject and a verb. So it's sometimes referred to as a standalone, complete thought. And that's what makes it independent. And I'll just give you an example of it. And I'll just use my birds because they're right here. So my parrots are loud, right? That's a full sentence. It's an independent clause because we have a subject. We have my parrots is working as an object here. And then we have the verb, or you could call this the predicate, are loud. So we know that this is an independent clause. This could also be an independent clause too, right? Parrots are loud. So instead of parrots being the object, which they were in the previous clause, here they're the subject, and then that's followed by a verb. So a dependent clause then is not a complete thought. So it's missing either a subject or a verb, and is thus dependent on a subject or verb from an independent clause. And this is where we join sentences together. So I'm going to write a sentence: parrots like to fly and eat a lot of fruit. So what we have here, and also sometimes I use IC and DC if I want to abbreviate those. So we've got this part here parrots like to fly, and then we have eat a lot of fruit. The parrots like to fly, that is an independent clause. And like we just looked at, right, we have our subject, and then we have our, this is actually a full verb here. This is just like is just a qualifier here. So parrots like to fly. So this is an independent clause. It's a complete thought. It has a subject and a verb. If we look at eat a lot of fruit, this is a dependent clause because if we just look at the green highlighted part alone, we have a verb, right? We have eat, and then a lot of fruit is an object, but we don't have a subject. The subject is actually referring back to parrots. So we have here an independent clause, an and then we have eat a lot of fruit. So before I go on to, because, and I'm talking about this because all of these are connected. So the way we talk about all of these things are the same way. This is a slightly different type of grammar. Your coordinating conjunctions are easier than subordinating conjunctions, and you've probably, many of you, if not all of you, have heard of the acronym FANBOYS, and that's all of the coordinating conjunctions, right? So that's for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and then so. So those are all of our coordinating conjunctions, and you want to know the coordinating conjunctions because based on your independent clauses and your dependent clauses and your coordinating conjunction depends on how you end up using commas. So when we have this sentence, these two thoughts here, right? We have an independent thought and a dependent thought. They're joined together by a coordinating conjunction, and so when you have that, and my highlight is my highlight still on? It's not good. So if we have an independent clause, and sorry, I'm going to use coordinating conjunctions as CC. We have an independent clause plus a coordinating conjunction plus a dependent clause. You want to use a comma. Oh, sorry. What am I talking about? You don't use a comma there. I just confused myself. And that's because the comma, we're often told, at least I was, and I've heard a lot of other people who have said the same thing, commas are pauses. And that's a lot of hooey. It's not true grammatically. There's really only one time when a comma is kind of a pause, and that's if you choose to put it in front of a quotation. The rest of the time you're using it for explicitly grammatical, sentence level, mechanical reasons. So, and the reason we don't want to do that is because what this suggests, what the comma suggests, is that what comes after the and is a complete thought. And if you've ever been told you have a comma splice, this is what a comma splice is. So a comma splice is where you're splitting up the thoughts. So because this is dependent and it's relying on, or it's dependent upon the subject from this previous clause, by virtue of putting this comma here, you're saying that, oh no, this is a complete thought, but it actually isn't. So we want to get rid of that comma because this needs a subject here. So the comma splice is when you split up a thought that is dependent on a previous, I'll just say previous complete or grammatically complete thought. So if you've ever been told comma splices, that's what they are. It's just, or if you have something like this, because I see this too, parrots like to fly, comma, eat a lot of fruit. Like if you just forget the coordinating conjunction, that's also a comma splice. So you're also still separating, and it just doesn't make sense, right? So it's harder when you read it and it all makes sense, but then you're like, oh, where does the comma go, right? Which is a very common question. So now, when you have, I'm going to copy this. I'm going to say this is no comma before the coordinating conjunction. Okay. Now if we have two complete thoughts, right? So now we have the IC plus the coordinating conjunction plus another independent clause. This is have a comma before the coordinating conjunction. So now that I've added this here, right, I'm going to change the color so that it's yellow. Now we've got two independent clauses and a coordinating conjunction. So now you can put the comma there because you are then telling the reader, this is a complete thought and this is a complete thought. I'm joining them with this coordinating conjunction. Therefore, I want the comma before that. So this is a pretty basic formula of very basic independent clause and dependent clause, and then you don't use the comma, versus if you have the two independent clauses joined by the coordinating conjunction, you do have a comma. Okay, this gets more difficult when you have more complicated sentences and or more complicated clauses, and say you have like 5 clauses and then a variety of subordinating conjunctions and coordinating conjunctions. So that can get more complicated. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to write a little bit more, and then we'll play around with semicolons and colons and commas and continue to do things like that. So I'll just continue to talk about my parrot. So Ollie is a green, my cursor has a mind of its own, who enjoys biting her feet and does not like my husband. And she also enjoys flying around. Churro is a cinnamon colored parrot who I did bring home a new parrot after our other parrot passed because I don't believe in keeping parrots alone. But so Churro is our new parrot who is just a baby and does not yet get along with Ollie and enjoys chewing on his toys and eating millet. Okay, so that's not great. It's terrible writing. It's like I'm writing in a journal. But I'm just dropping writing onto the page. So I think I just put end stops in here, right? I just put a period here. So, okay. So how we would want to break this up and how we can add things. So first we want to identify where we have any kind of coordinating conjunctions. I'm going to add some subordinating conjunctions as well. So, okay, I don't even know if it's kind of true, but so I added a because, which is a subordinating conjunctions, and I'll add another one. Can't spell humans today. All right, so we have a coordinating conjunction up here. Put it in blue. We have a coordinating conjunction there. I think that's the only one. No, I have another one here, and I have another one here. And I'm going to write something so that I have to have a colon and a list. So, or it doesn't have to be a list, but now this is getting into creative writing. Okay. Yes, we also have 2 cats. So, and here's a coordinating conjunction. And here's a coordinating conjunction. Okay. So so what you want to do is whenever you find your coordinating conjunctions, what you want to do is look at what you have before it and then look at what you have after it and determine, is it independent or is it dependent? So this is obviously an independent clause because we have our subject, Ollie. We have my least favorite verb, which is because it's passive. And then we've got a bunch of other stuff in here. Oh, I forgot that I have a lot of coordinating conjunctions in here. And, okay, so we have this, before this and, we have a complete sentence, and then after this and, we also have an independent clause. So that means that, so here, right, does not like my husband, that's a dependent clause. So we don't want a comma here because this dependent clause is dependent on this subject, on Ollie. However, here, between this full clause that includes the independent and the dependent clause, after this, we have an independent clause, and I should probably change this color to green. The colors are going to get confusing. So we do want a comma here because we have the she, so we have the subject, and then we have the verb, right, the flying around, and I ended that with a preposition. I don't even need the around, so that's editing for concision. Do I need the around? No, she just enjoys flying. I presume it's around, so I don't really need to say it. Okay, so I didn't add a comma here. I added a comma here. If we go on to the next thing, and I missed this coordinating conjunction, and was the only coordinating conjunction. Oh, I do have this one. It's not really working as a coordinating conjunction here, but that's okay. Okay, so we have this before, and this is telling me it's green because it wants to turn that into a non-restrictive clause, but so we'll go ahead and put the comma in there, but you don't, that's a more advanced conversation about commas. So all of this here that goes before the and is an independent clause. So because we have churro, who is the subject, and then we have that horrible verb again, is, and then a bunch of other stuff. And then after this, right, after that and, we have all of this, which is a dependent clause. So the first thing I would say about this writing is I have too many coordinating conjunctions here. I'm really giving a list, so I might want to change that. So churro is a cinnamon colored, and this would be hyphenated because cinnamon and colored are both qualifying parrot, who is just a baby and does not, so then I have all these descriptors about this bird, right? Does not yet get along with Ollie, enjoys chewing on his toys, and eating millet because birds really enjoy eating foods that humans do not. While sometimes human birds stay inside food. Very long sentence. Too long. So what I would do is turn this into a list instead. So does not yet get along with Ollie. I would get rid of this. Enjoys chewing on his toys. Now, for parallelism, we want to look at the verbs. So we have our subjects. So when you're doing a list, you need to look at everything that's coming in that list. Churro is a cinnamon-colored parrot who's just a baby. Churro does not get along with Ollie. Churro enjoys chewing on his toys. Churro eating millet, right? Now, the verb here is a gerund, a G-E-R-U-N-D, right? It's an ing verb, but we have a qualifier before that. So, what I would do here, honestly, is I would say, and enjoys chewing on his toys and eating millet. So, I did that because I want, and this is where the conversation about the Oxford comma, or what's called the serial comma, is important. I haven't been I've seen some people not use the serial comma, and I just have to ignore it because I know that a lot of you are working in environments where it's okay not to use a serial comma, but I'm going to make a case for it right here. So, and the serial comma is that one where in a list of 3 or more things, do you need that final comma before the coordinating conjunction? And I always argue yes, not because I'm on a certain, well, I am on a side, but I do it because I believe it's much easier for the reader to follow along. So, and we talk about list items as entities. So in this list item, we have this entity, we have this entity, and then I want to have all of this, just this bit, I'm going to put that as a dependent clause, as entities. So the final comma here, and the comma here, the comma here, the no comma here tells me that, right, there's 3 total entities here. There's 1, 2, and 3, and this third one just happens to be 2 things combined. And I combined them because chewing and eating are relatively the same. So that was just a writing choice I made. If I had this, if I grammatically believed these and for the purposes of meaning believed that if I really wanted to make them distinct, then you could do that. But I don't really want to do that because to me they are similar enough. Okay, so, and then I would stop the sentence there because it's too long of a sentence. So, so how I would go on from there is, now I've started this one with a because, and I've told some people in feedback that you never put comma before because, and you don't. No one ever told me that. I had to find out on my own. What I am going to do a little bit of is cohesion. So cohesion is how your sentences stick together and how you create like good flow so that your reader, if I've ever said like there's choppy writing here, or you want to transition from sentence to sentence and from idea to idea like really well, and that's what makes for good cohesion. So if this were the beginning of my sentence, if I just went from this description of churro, this bird, and what this bird likes, to this other idea in this sentence, which is the relationship or comparison between what birds like to eat and what humans like to eat, there is something missing. So you might want to say something like, while eating millet, oh God, I hate is. It's going to drive me crazy. Here we go. I'm going to do so I'm trying to create cohesion, and this is what we call, it's what I call it. It's the then to the now transition. And this is for cohesion. So what you do is you refer to when you're writing a new sentence, you refer back to something you were just talking about then in the beginning of that new sentence, and then you use that as a transition into bringing in the new idea. So that's where while birds enjoy eating millet, so I'm pointing back to the then. I was at this point then talking about this in order to go on to this new idea about the food that humans eat versus birds. So that creates much better cohesion. So it flows a little bit better. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So I'm going to stop there for a moment because I don't want to get lost from the independent clauses and dependent clauses. So I'm going to do that down a little, right? So we've talked about these kind of basic independent clause with coordinating conjunctions, and then if you have a dependent clause or an independent clause, when to have a comma and when not to have a comma. So if we want to add a semicolon to the mix, or even a colon, you can certainly do that. And that, I'll just pull something that I just wrote. I mean, I could also do something from here, but I don't want to do that yet. I'll just pull from here. So I'll just copy and bring it down. So if we want to look at what happens when we mix all these things together. So, and honestly, you don't need that word. That's an adverb. Adverbs you oftentimes don't need, like very or really, or those words that end in ly. For the most part, they're not necessary in writing, unless you absolutely need it. Get rid of it. But like, what's the difference between enjoy and really enjoy? Have fun explaining that to me. I get into arguments like that with my husband all the time. Define enjoy for me versus really enjoy. Okay, good job. You didn't do it. So birds enjoy eating foods. So I'd say eating some foods that humans do not enjoy, not an equal sign, such as millet, now that that's gone. And I've made this comment for some people, but anytime you have a such as, you always want a comma before that because you're giving an example. So you need to set that off grammatically. And normally you would not have a comma before while because while is a subordinating conjunction. But because such as millet is all set off, you would keep that comma there. So while sometimes, and sometimes actually, would also get set off because it is considered here an introductory phrase to this next, because we have a new grammatical subject here. Humans and birds eat the same type of foods, for example, fruits and vegetables. I'll use an EG there. And then I'm going to use a colon. However, it is recommended that you do not second person. Okay, so now I've added a semicolon. Now, the thing with the semicolon, so again, you have to have an independent clause before the semicolon. You don't always have to have a coordinating conjunction. You can, I'll just put it in brackets because it's possible that you have a coordinating conjunction. Now, if you want to have a semicolon, the thing on the other side of the semicolon has to be an independent clause. So independent clauses have to come before and after semicolons. This is oftentimes where people get confused. They'll have a semicolon and then they'll have a dependent clause after it, or they'll have a semicolon preceding a list. So that's not the use of a semicolon. So there is method in the madness of the period versus the semicolon versus the colon. I did this all wrong. The comma versus the semicolon versus the colon versus the period. So that's the order of, I'm going to say pauses, which are really grammatical meaning makers to joining ideas. So the comma is not having anything is the least amount of space between the grammar, right? Just like we had up here in this simple version of a independent clause, coordinating conjunction, dependent clause. So there's no punctuation there, which means that there's grammatically everything is really close together. So there's no grammatical space. When you have a semicolon or when you have a comma, there's slightly more grammatical space, right? So when you have something like this, right, it's like this is its own grammatical space and then this is its own grammatical space, versus here, right, where this is all one grammatical space because this is a dependent clause. With a colon, you're making even more grammatical space. Same thing with a semicolon, and then with a colon, and then with a full stop, you're like, stop, totally done, moving on to a whole new thing. So there is a hierarchy grammatically of when to use the nothing versus a comma versus semicolon versus a colon versus the full stop or the period. So, and it all has to do with the grammar or the intended meaning behind the grammar and how close or how far the grammar should be in order to make sense for the reader. So here you can see that I've used a semicolon because before this I have a full clause. And then after it, we have an introductory phrase here with however and with that transitional word. And then we have it is. And then very vague, and is, again, I can't get away from, but this is also a full thought. So that's why here, right, with that semicolon, you have to have the independent clause on each side of it. You don't with the colon. You need, so if you're using a colon, and you might have a coordinating conjunction in there, you might not, plus the colon, it's usually a dependent clause that comes after the colon. You don't want an independent clause after a colon. There's times when you might have one, like if you have a colon before a quotation, but the thing that people usually forget with a colon is that you still have to have that full independent clause. And that I see a lot when people say something like, okay. So that's an example, and you don't only use colons before lists. It's just, I think, one of the most common places that people know when to use commas. But this is not grammatically correct because birds enjoy eating food like, that's not a complete thought. That's not an independent clause. So you want to change that to something like that. Birds enjoy eating food such as the following, right? That is an independent clause, and then you follow it. Although, if you were going to go back and edit for concision, I would be like, why do you have as the following colon, right? Why not just that? So, but that was just to give you an example of where people tend to misuse the colon, is they'll have that dependent clause before it rather than the independent clause. So I'm going to get into a little bit of, I underlined a few things that I thought would be useful for, because sometimes what I'll do in face-to-face classes is I will work with students as a class and we'll go through a paper and revise it together. And it's one of the things that I usually get really good feedback on because it's not easy to do. But we'll just take what I've got here underlined. So, and this is really bad writing, and because it's missing cohesion. And cohesion is related to this conversation because how you join your ideas and your thoughts also affects the cohesion, right? It affects the flow of things. So if I've ever said like, you could join these sentences, or what about doing this instead? I'm usually talking about cohesion or how you're joining your ideas for effective style or effective quote unquote flow. I say the word flow. We don't use flow, but I use it because it seems to resonate the most with people. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and read this. But first, I have a perfect example of what I was just talking about. So here, The study also indicates the top 3 characteristics for males in advertisements were : so that's a perfect example of what I just did. This is a dependent clause, followed by a colon, followed by a list, right? Powerful entity 1, aggressive entity 2, coordinating conjunction, and then hostile attitudes, entity 3. It's also not parallel because powerful, aggressive, and had hostile attitudes. So this one has a verb, whereas the other ones don't. So you would want to get rid of that. Powerful, aggressive, and hostile attitudes. And then ignore this. This is MLA. So I'm not doing this to talk about MLA. So we're just going to ignore citations for the time being. No, you could revise this in a variety of ways. You could do something like the study. Firstly, just to edit for, okay, sorry. To edit for concision, right? You don't need also the study, or you could, if you might say something like additionally instead. If we put this back, well, I'm just going to bring down the whole paragraph here and bring it back together. If we look at a study on, so this is a table, so a study on, we might want a study titled, and we want to, depends on if you're writing an MLA or APA, but so I'm doing this for MLA right now. A study titled blank, right, lists a table with its, this is possessive, so it doesn't get an apostrophe, results. This is where you would want a comma because it comes before a gerund verb, the ing verb, indicating that, we don't need that comma there, indicating that 82.6% of males portrayed in advertisements were aggressive. Lists a table with its results is wordy writing. So this is where you would want to do editing for concision. So you might say something like a study titled blank. You don't need any of this. I know you guys didn't write this, but I'm using the royal you. Indicates for MLA, indicated if you were writing an APA, indicates that 82.6% of males portrayed in advertisements were aggressive, right? You don't need that. It has a table that has this thing, right? You can just tell us the blah, blah, blah. There is a citation missing here, but again, I totally don't want to talk about that. Additionally, we can use it. This is that pronoun antecedent rule. If you've heard of that. And that is it, the pronoun is pointing back to ante, right? Ante means before. So is pointing back to a particular noun, and that noun is the study. So if you ever get the feedback vague pronoun, it means that you have faltered your pronoun antecedent construction. That if this said like these studies and the 2 studies, including Title A and Title B, both indicated that blah blah blah. Additionally, I'd be like, okay, well, which study are you referring to, right? So you just have to make sure that it's very clear to the reader that this pronoun is referring back to this. So that's why in this case we can do that. It indicates, and again, we're using the same verb, so for variety, we might want to change that. It indicates the top 3 characteristics for males and advertisements. Include, if you wanted to use the colon, right, include the following, right, powerful, aggressive, and hostile attitudes. So that's how you would better construct that. And here I would just change the verb. I usually just say, just for fun's sake, because it's easy. It posits the top 3 characteristics. Okay, this information, just as a recommendation, I would always avoid, after you integrate evidence, don't say this unless you're, I mean, it's not terrible to do, but so for example, this person says this information, and it's like, what information? you're expecting me, the reader, to go back, read the quotation, because that's what I would have to do as a grader. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, the longer it takes a grader to grade, the worse the grade is going to be. So this information suggests that character archetypes are similar to that of Dante's, that's character in this text, the video game, have had success in previous advertisements, and that it is a trend that will most likely continue until it stops being effective. This is an unnecessary comma. Because there's until, you do not need a comma before until, even though this is an independent clause. So if you were writing this, my note to you would be, what information are you talking about? The information that males as portrayed in advertisements were aggressive? And how does it suggest that? So suggesting that character archetypes, it's doing this because it wants this, are similar to that of Dante's, have had success in previous advertisements. So none of this makes sense to me. Like, in terms of what the writer is doing. Here, the writer is saying, hey, there's a study that indicates that this large percentage of males portrayed in advertisements were aggressive. Okay. Is that even a good thing to like, what else is there in there? And then this source also says that, or also lists these 3 characteristics for males portrayed in advertisements: powerful, aggressive, and hostile attitudes. Whether powerful or not is negative, our writer doesn't tell us. So we kind of have to infer that it is, because it's lumped with aggressive and hostile attitudes. But how all of that feeds into this quote-unquote analysis that aggressive men make for, and I'm doing a lot of inferring here, but I think what this writer is saying is that regardless that they are portrayed as aggressive, this is what makes for success. Like, people want to see aggressive men in video games or aggressive men in advertisements. And this part, it's a trend that will most likely continue until it stops being effective, is a waste of space. I don't know why it's there. But I also had to do a lot of work, and I don't even know if I'm interpreting it the way the writer intended. I honestly don't think the writer knew what they intended. But going down to here, you'll see very quickly what I mean by cohesion. So the people are all dressed in black and white. So just for some context, they're describing the video game commercial for, I think, Assassin's Creed 3. But the people are all dressed in black and walk with their heads down, a subtle sign of submission to something or someone. The advertisement has established at this point, I don't know what point, the main character is a rebel or someone who is against the normal. Not a word there. Next, we see a person reading a newspaper that portrays Dante as a terrorist. In this moment, just like at this point, I don't know what you're talking about, the audience is now not sure if Dante is good or evil. They are using semicolon, comma here correctly. However, comma, that's called a buried however, and they are using that correctly, which is awesome. Since the advertisement is focused on Dante, a comma is needed because this is an introductory phrase. The audience also has no choice but to pay attention to him. So the audience is held captive. Okay, hostage audience. So hopefully you were able to feel how, like, from this sentence, there was no transition to this sentence. There was no transition to this sentence, to this sentence. There's no cohesion here whatsoever. You could basically put a bullet point here, a bullet point here, a bullet point here, and a bullet point here, and it would be the exact same thing. So this is what we call choppy writing. Sometimes it's called bullet point writing because there is really no grammatical narrative happening here. So that then to now formula of moving from sentence to sentence is not being executed at all here. So I'm just going to take a stab at it. The writer hasn't given me much to work with, but the people are all dressed in black and walk with their heads down. a subtle sign of submission to something or someone. Firstly, this is a comma splice, right? Because we have this here, which is an independent clause, and then we have this here, which is an independent clause. And then we have, sorry, that's part of it, the article. And then we have this comma here. So this is creating a comma splice. It's separating these two things, and there's no coordinating conjunction. The easiest way to fix that is I would put a colon. So this is a place where you can have a colon that doesn't have a list that comes after it. And it is an independent clause, but that's fine. Because what the colon does grammatically in this place, the meaning that it explains to the reader, because grammar is a meaning-making process for your readers, is that the writer is saying one thing here, and then there's a colon. So the colon, what comes after the colon, should be further information about the thing that came before the colon. So the colon here to me would be the best example, or the best punctuation to use. A semicolon would not be the best thing to use, and that's because of the grammatical meaning here. So the purpose of saying a subtle sign of submission to something or someone is they're further qualifying or further providing information about the way the characters look in the beginning of the advertisement. So there's that idea, and then it goes on to say the advertisement has established at this point the main character is a rebel or someone who is against the normal. So we want to transition between the idea of, or the description of how the people are in the commercial versus how the main character is portrayed in the commercial. So what I would do is say something like, this subtle sign of submission, right? That's the then. I'm pointing to something I just wrote about, underscores the main character, Dante. I'm just writing, I might revise this in a second. I might put that clause in, that the main character, Dante, is, oh God, what did they write? The main character rebel, someone who is against the norm. This subtle sign of submission underscores that the main character, or I should say that, I'm going to change it up a little bit. This is the fun of revising. The advertisement's subtle sign of submission. No, hold on. I don't like that either. Okay, I like that a little bit better. The advertisement's decision to depict characters in a subtle sign of submission, or might use a different verb here, heightens the entrance of the main character, Dante, who is clearly portrayed as rebellious. And I think if I remember the commercial, as he walks in the opposite direction of everyone else. Okay, I think that's what happens in the commercial. So I would get rid of all of that, because saying they're rebellious and goes against the norm, they're kind of the same thing. And I didn't spell portrayed right. Portrayed as rebellious as he walks in the opposite direction of everyone else. This is a subordinate conjunction, so I would not have a comma before it. To edit for concision, you oftentimes can use those things I told you not to, which are the adjectives. But I have two as's there, and I kind of want to get rid of those. Who is rebelliously portrayed, and I can even get more done there. Walking in the opposite direction of everyone else. Okay, so here, right, took the then from the previous statement, a subtle sign of submission to something or someone, and then I used that to open this next sentence before moving on to the next idea in this sentence, which is the main character who is portrayed rebelliously. So if I were to do that for the next bit, and I'm just going to do it one more time because this can get draining really quick and probably very boring to watch. That says the advertisement has established at this point the main characters are okay. Sorry, that's just what I revised. Let's look at the next one. Next, always a bad word to use when you're writing. If you're at a bank, it's fine, but not when you're writing an academic essay. Next, we see a person reading a newspaper that portrays Dante as a terrorist. So that one's a more easy cohesion to construct because we already have this idea that he's rebelliously portrayed. So you could say something like, likewise, or I should say, not only but also is one of my default writing things that I tend to use too much as a writer, so I'm criticizing myself as I write this. But not only is Dante portrayed as a rebel, but he is also described as a terrorist. Sorry, I'm just reading the other sentence. In a newspaper that one of the characters is reading. Okay. So again, I have done the then to now a transition. So not only is Dante portrayed as a rebel, I'm pointing back to what I was then talking about in the previous sentence and using that as a transition to move on to something new. Okay, not just a rebel, but a terrorist, right? So that's a heightening of the characterization of this particular person, of Dante. And so that would get rid of that sentence. So in this moment, and then I'm not going to go on, but that is the, where I don't know where I put here. The then to now transition, which is for cohesion. So hopefully that gave some help or some ideas as to how you want to work with transition. And I didn't spend a whole lot of time. There's so much to really explain about independent clauses, dependent clauses, commas, semicolons, and colons. But these kind of constructions are the primary ones, and you just have varieties of them that you use. And that's why when you see things in rubrics like variety of sentence style, we want variety in sentence style because you don't want the same, however, comma, blah, blah, blank, although, comma, blah, blah, blank, likewise, comma, blah, blah, blank. It's like your reader's bored. So sentence variety is important, and you do that also through varying the ways you choose to join sentences and varying the ways you choose to write sentences. I was just looking for what I revised. So that is all I'm not going to talk about subordinating conjunctions right now. They're just more complicated to talk about than coordinating conjunctions. I might end up making a part 2 to this at some point where I do a little bit more of this and I add subordinating conjunctions to them. And I say they're more complicated because there are way more subordinating conjunctions than there are coordinating conjunctions. And coordinating conjunctions people tend to be more familiar with than subordinating conjunctions. So the fanboys are something that tend to come up a lot more commonly than subordinating conjunctions. So I'll probably end up in the near future making a part 2 to this to continue my discussion of cohesion and how we join ideas and how we join sentences and how we join thoughts in order to craft effective paragraphs. And then I'll add subordinating conjunctions to that conversation. But that's all I'm going to do for now, and keep on writing, and I will talk to you guys soon. Okay, bye.